This week's episode of the ArtTactic Podcast is brought to you by ArtTactic.com, where we've just redesigned our entire website. Make sure to check it out, and any reports or subscriptions you buy, make sure to use the promo code PODCAST15 to get a 15% discount for our podcast listeners. Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. Hope everyone had a wonderful holiday season and a great start to the new year. We wrapped up 2024 with a final episode recapping the art market, and now we're kicking off 2025 by looking ahead. Joining us on today's episode is Tim Schneider, founder of The Gray Market. For years, Tim has started off the calendar by sharing his insightful annual art market predictions, and his newly published 2025 forecast is no exception. You can read the full list with his commentary on his Substack, and he's here joining us today to dive into some of the highlights. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Tim, thanks so much for joining us.
Adam, always a pleasure to be on.
So before we dive into your predictions for 2025, I want to start with your recent move of the gray market to Substack. Can you tell us a little bit more about what prompted the transition and what does it mean for your existing readers as well as those who might be discovering the gray market for the first time that you're now on Substack?
Sure. So as some of your listeners probably know, I had for the past roughly 7 years been a part of the sort of official art trade media. I was at ArtNet News for about 5.5 years, and then I was at the art newspaper for the last year, just always in the kind of art market editorial side of things. And I went independent at the end of last year, and it was sort of a combination of different factors. One of them, I think, is really that I just increasingly felt like the types of work that had really kind of found resonance out there, that had really struck a chord with people in the market, were things that were about, or let me say it this way, they were really things that came out of me sort of having the capacity to take a longer view of things, to get really deep into the weeds on things, and talk about the big picture in a way that I found increasingly difficult to do when I was really tied to the day-to-day, week-to-week cycle of events and auctions and whatever else that you have to cover when you are an art market editor on staff at a trade media publication. And that is, to be perfectly clear, no disrespect to anybody who is doing that work. It's really difficult work. It's valuable work. But I eventually just got to a point where I felt like to be able to do the type of work that I wanted to do and that people seemed to find the most valuable, I needed to sort of approach it from a different way, hence going independent.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we're big fans of the gray market at ArtTactic, and we definitely recommend our listeners check it out on your Substack if they haven't already. So I'm really eager to get into some of your predictions for 2025. One that really stood out to me was Frieze will sell to a group of investors led by Ari Emanuel. Now, there's been considerable speculation about Frieze's business strategies in recent years, with some of their recent moves raising a lot of questions. So, for example, they acquired the Armory Show, but the Armory Show still conflicts in the fair calendar with one of their other fairs, Frieze Soul. I don't really get it. They also bought Expo Chicago, yet the fair doesn't seem to have evolved in any meaningful way since the acquisition. And then Frieze London, while it hasn't really changed, it faces growing competition from Art Basel Paris, which takes place just a week later in the fall. And even Frieze New York, since leaving Randall's Island, it remains a relatively small fair for such a major city. And it's in a somewhat unconventional venue at the Shed, which, when it originally went there, it seemed like a temporary solution. So with so much uncertainty surrounding their fairs, what's your perspective on the current state of Frieze, and what leads you to believe that a sale specifically to Ari Emanuel might actually be on the horizon?
I think that a lot of people who are looking closely at what's happening in the fair sector understand that honestly, the challenges out there right now are really, really tough. I mean, obviously, we have been in at the very least, a suppressed market for close to 2 years at this point. And when you're in that situation as a dealer, you're obviously looking around and saying, okay, well, which costs are actually most important for me to continue to pay? How do I put myself out there? What do I still need to do? And where can I actually kind of maybe chill out on a little bit? And given how much more expensive fares have gotten over the years, given how many more of them have cropped up, I think that there are a lot of people looking around and saying, like, well, how much of this should we really still be involved in? And that's a tough challenge for the fairs themselves to come up with good answers to, I think. Now, I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that like fairs are going to disappear. That would be absolutely bonkers. It's not going to happen. They still do a really important service out there in the day-to-day cycles of the art market. That being said, I think that when it comes to Frieze in particular, one of the things that you have to look at is, as you're saying, like how do all these pieces fit together? And I can promise you from having talked to folks at Frieze, they are so sick of hearing about how the various fairs in their calendar don't really align that well. But the reality is that people keep saying it. The actual consumers, the visitors, the exhibitors still have these questions. And this all leads to the idea that if you are going to go out there and literally put your money on fairs and the potential of fairs as a business proposition, you need to have a kind of almost evangelical belief in the service that they provide and the untapped potential within them. And that is something that Ari Emanuel, who is currently the chief executive of Endeavor, which is the conglomerate that owns Frieze, that's something that he's had for the better part of a decade. He was the driving force in the acquisition of Frieze by Endeavor, or one of them anyway. He's been the driving force behind the acquisition by Endeavor of a variety of other live event properties, such as the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And the reality is that he's somebody who seems to, by all accounts, really want this. There was a story in Bloomberg back at the beginning of November, which a lot of people in the art world seem to have missed, which basically just reported that Emmanuel had raised $100 million with the express intent of trying to bid on Frieze and the other live event properties that Endeavor is putting out there or exploring a potential sale of, to use their parlance. And he has the intent of raising more. And he really, really wants to do this. And I think that when you look around the landscape of which other buyers are out there and like really have the capital and the capacity to do this kind of a deal, I just don't see anybody else who is really stark competition for somebody who has been honestly one of the most driven, most almost monomaniacal deal makers of the past generation or so.
Yeah, I'm sure Frieze will continue to be discussed for all of the reasons we mentioned, and it'll be interesting to see if a sale does take place or not in 2025. So another one of your predictions that I really enjoyed is that Beeple's Everydays, the first 5,000 days, will return to the market. I have to say, most art market predictions that I read tend to be broader, more macro ones. So seeing a prediction about a specific artwork being sold was really fun to read. And while the overall NFT market has cooled dramatically, and it really isn't making headlines nearly as frequently, I found it really fascinating to think about a high-profile work like this from that segment resurfacing at auction or on the market. What leads you to believe that this work might come back to the market?
The main thing is that the market for NFTs is essentially a proxy market for the market for cryptocurrencies generally. And if you look at what's been happening in cryptocurrency prices over the course of the past 6 months to a year, and honestly, especially in the past 2 or 3 months, they're basically hitting highs that they've never hit before. The price of Bitcoin broke $100,000 for the first time in December. It's currently trading at around $102,000 as of me checking the market right before I logged into the Zoom call. It's Monday, January 6th, just as a reference point. And honestly, when you look around at even some of the other activity within the NFT marketplaces themselves, you're starting to see these dramatic or at least significant price rises in both NFT series that we're familiar with, such as the CryptoPunks and the Bored Ape Yacht Club, and then some other series that have come up in the time since and maybe are in a kind of strict art world parlance, like sort of ridiculous, but frankly speaking, they're still selling for a lot of money. There's still a lot of activity among them. So that's one part of it. And the other part of it too is that when we're talking about the sort of premier properties within the NFT marketplace, which Beeple's Everydays certainly qualifies as. I mean, I referred to it in my story or my predictions post itself as the holy grail of NFTs. I think it deserves that kind of moniker at this point. But when we're talking about this sort of top tier of NFTs that people in the traditional art market will also care about, we also have to look at what just happened with Maurizio Catalan's Comedian at Sotheby's back in November. As some people who are listening to this podcast may know, that became a kind of cause celeb within the crypto and NFT community because of the fact that it was viewed as a kind of proto NFT, the idea being that what makes this thing valuable isn't the actual physical manifestation of it. It isn't the image. It isn't the banana. It is actually just the certificate that goes with it, which is essentially the same idea as what NFTs are. Like what makes them valuable is the smart contract that underlies them, not the image itself. And as you know, Adam, that piece went bonkers at auction. It sold for $6.2 million with fees, which was more than quadruple its high estimate of $1.5 million. And it was bought by, lo and behold, crypto entrepreneur Justin Sun. So there is this kind of ferment that's happening within this marketplace again that I think people in the fine art world need to pay attention to. And to be perfectly honest, this prediction about Everydays coming back to the market is maybe a little bit bombastic, but I think that it takes something like this to really just call attention to the fact that this is a space that is once again booming and that we should expect some real activity there again.
And I think it's also worth noting that one of the most remarkable aspects of the Catalan banana is how rarely a contemporary artwork manages to break out of the niche art world and actually capture mainstream attention. And so regardless of what you think about the banana, it undeniably achieved that. And I think one could argue that that level of exposure directly contributed to its incredible auction result. So similarly, if the Beeple work were to return to the market, it already is the most expensive NFT ever sold. It's likely that its reappearance at auction would generate significant media coverage as well. And this kind of attention could serve potentially as an additional motivator for the current owner of the Beeple work, especially after witnessing the exposure and success that followed for the banana.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that the real point here is that crypto people are really looking at the year ahead as this sort of decentralized financial utopia, potentially, with Donald Trump coming back into office and his son promising that he, meaning his father, is going to be, quote, the most pro-crypto president in history. There are a lot of people who put a lot of money into getting that man back in office specifically because they think that he's going to be extremely friendly to the crypto market. And again, that's something that I think we need to pay attention to.
That's a really interesting point. I think most people in the art world have forgotten about NFTs, but maybe that market isn't dead after all. So one of your other predictions is that at least one high-end commercial gallery will announce the opening of a pop-up exhibition or office in Saudi Arabia. So it seems like the art market is always eager to explore new geographies and engage with untapped or emerging client bases. How much progress have auction houses and galleries already made in establishing a foothold in Saudi Arabia? And what makes you think we'll see increased activity in this market in 2025?
Sure. So there's been a lot of activity over the course of the past few years within the Gulf region in general, and I think in particular in the past year within Saudi Arabia. I'm going to focus on the second one of those because otherwise this conversation becomes sprawling. We're talking about what's going on in Abu Dhabi. We're talking about just all kinds of stuff. So within Saudi Arabia itself, here are a few data points for you. Back in the fall, Christie's announced that it had received a commercial license to operate in Saudi Arabia. It is now going to open an office in Riyadh. Sotheby's is about to hold its first live sale ever in Saudi Arabia. That's going to happen next month in Diriyah. There is the Desert X Al Ula Festival, or I guess really kind of public art biennial for all intents and purposes. This is for people who aren't familiar. Desert X is a public art biennial that takes place in California every couple of years. They have now held three separate editions of it in Al Ula, which is this historic site in the desert outside of Saudi Arabia. And it has just gotten increasingly bigger and bigger name artists to participate in it. And there's just a huge amount of activity there, not just within the art world, but within the kind of larger cultural landscape too. There's all kinds of information out there about Hollywood and its interest in doing business with Saudi Arabia. They actually just held the Red Sea Film Festival, which is this exactly what it sounds like. It's the sort of new initiative or new-ish initiative anyway that, again, as I was just talking about in the context of the art world, has gotten a larger and larger component of, or I should say, a larger and larger contingency of A-list actors, agents, studio heads, etc., to come and just see what's going on, to be a part of it, to meet people, to see what business there might be to do down in Saudi Arabia. And so in my mind, this is a place that the cultural sectors have identified as the place to go for major funding. And I just, given that we haven't yet seen a major dealer set down, I don't want to say set down roots there, because I think it's probably still too early for somebody to just say, hey, I'm going to open a permanent space in Saudi Arabia. I do, however, think that the idea of having some kind of a pop-up, some kind of an office that really, again, kind of grabs attention and announces that dealer's presence in this market as somebody who is taking that culture and, frankly speaking, its wealth and its taste seriously. I just think that that's something that is highly likely to happen within the next 11 and a half months.
So I found one of your other predictions to be both fascinating and unsettling, and that was that at least one art industry scam will be powered by deepfakes. Of course, the unregulated nature of the art market, combined with high-value transactions, seems to make the art market especially vulnerable to scams. I mean, even to this day, when I call galleries to verbally confirm wiring instructions on behalf of my clients, sometimes the responses from galleries range from surprise to confusion, and I have to explain why exactly I'm doing that. And I think that really highlights the lack of consistent due diligence standards that we have in this industry. Deepfakes are a relatively new technology, and I think they have the potential to disrupt, of course, not just the art market, but every industry, news outlets, anything you can think of. I guess, can you first explain what exactly are deepfakes, and how do you think a scam involving deepfakes might actually unfold in the art world?
Right. So let's start with the what are deepfakes aspect of things. So deepfakes are a term for essentially AI generated imagery or voices or both that are used to basically replicate the image and the voice of an actual person. So like right now, Adam, you and I are on a Zoom call, we're on video, we're looking at each other, we're hearing each other. And the reality is that at this point, the technology that's out there could actually create a highly realistic version of both of us, assuming that there's enough data out there for it to collect and sort of process in this kind of a way. And it could actually create a completely false version of either one of us. It would sound like us, it would look like us. And unless you were really paying attention, it would be really difficult to know that the image that you're seeing on screen isn't actually me. So it sounds very sci-fi, and frankly speaking, it is. But we have just reached a point where this is a part of the day-to-day world that we live in. And I don't think that people either in the art world or really, frankly, in the wider world are prepared for this to be something that they're going to have to really think through.
I completely agree. And while I haven't personally encountered a deepfake in the art world yet, I know it's only a matter of time. Right now, I mostly come across them in really bizarre forms, trying to be comical, these deepfakes on social media. Maybe you've seen them, things like politicians in absurd scenarios, Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un kissing, I don't know, bizarre things like that. But the reality is that the world isn't fully prepared for this technology, and as it becomes more sophisticated, these deepfakes will look increasingly accurate and convincing. And eventually, we may reach a point where deepfakes are indistinguishable from reality, where it becomes nearly impossible to tell what's real and what's fabricated. And honestly, I'm not sure what happens once we cross that line. What do you think that may mean for the art world? If deepfakes become that advanced, how do you think someone could leverage them to scam or deceive people in the art world?
So there's something that already happened in the finance world that I think really lays out the blueprint. I'm sorry. So there's something that already happened in the finance world last year that I think really lays out the blueprint for this in a frankly kind of terrifying way. So we'll just start there because I think it maps really cleanly onto what could and I think probably will soon enough happen in the art market. So early last year, there was a story that came out about how a someone on the finance side of this engineering firm called Arup had gotten a request from the CFO of the company to wire a really large amount of money to a specific party. And this seemed strange to this person who was in charge of being able to just disperse this money. And he essentially pushed back on it. I was like, "Are you sure this is something you want me to do?" And what he got back was this CFO telling him, "Well, I understand why you're nervous. Let's just hop on a video call and we can talk through it." So they got onto a Zoom call with not just the CFO, but with 8 of their coworkers, including the CFO. And they have a whole meeting about why it's time for this guy to essentially send around $26 million out to this particular party that he otherwise doesn't know. The thing is that everybody on this call is a deepfake. It's all imagery, it's all voices being generated using AI that allows a scammer to basically put on the mask and voice of the chief financial officer of this company and tell somebody who works there why they need to send a huge amount of money to a particular person. And understandably, I think the guy went and did it. And that's just hugely different from, again, getting like a kind of weird email from somebody in your company asking you to do something that strikes you as being a little odd. The idea that you can now have, I guess, even to go back to the example that you used, Adam, if you're diligent enough that when you're getting ready to send a wire to somebody, you're actually calling them up now and saying, "Hey, I just want to double check this. Where should I be sending it?" So that you can get the vocal confirmation from it. Theoretically, that call could get intercepted now by somebody who can approximate the voice using technology of the person that you're originally planning on talking to. And they can confirm, in scare quotes, that you should send the money to a particular account. And in fact, it's not the correct account. It's a scam account. But there's now this sort of high grade AI generated camouflage that scammers can put on to basically short circuit what used to be the best way to confirm that something that seemed off is in fact okay. So this is just kind of where we are. It sounds absolutely bonkers, but it's the reality. And I think that people, again, are like really going to have to study up on how to deal with this kind of a thing.
Yeah, and to expand on the example I gave about verbally confirming wiring instructions, I mean, when the bank details on an invoice seem normal, by that I mean when an account name matches the gallery name, I still confirm the wiring instructions verbally, but I'm less suspicious. If an account name seemed unusual or atypical, I would definitely be a bit more concerned. But regardless, I will always make it a point to confirm the wiring instructions verbally. Now, every once in a while, I do have a paranoid thought. I've stopped to think, what if a scammer has hacked the gallery's website and actually changed the phone number listed on their website to the scammer's phone number? That would mean that I would be inadvertently calling up the scammer, thinking I'm calling up the gallery, and they would be verifying their fraudulent details. So as a result, sometimes I will Google the gallery and actually call the phone number that Google suggests, or at least check to see if it matches the gallery website's phone number. Anyways, my point is that there's a growing need for more thorough due diligence in the art world to protect against these kind of scams. I mean, the scam I mentioned is very basic. Deepfakes is much more convincing, much more advanced, and will fool a lot more people. And unfortunately, many people in the art world don't even take basic steps, like verbally confirming instructions, which I think ultimately leaves the art market in a very vulnerable place. So I agree with you. I think we definitely will have a deepfake scam in the art world. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. So before we let you go, you mentioned before the episode that you'll actually be sharing a brand new prediction for 2025 exclusively for this podcast, one that wasn't included in your Substack. So I'm excited to hear it. What's your prediction?
Okay, so your ArtTactic Podcast exclusive prediction is that guarantees by the three big auction houses, Christie's, Sotheby's, and Phillips, will rebound by at least 25% in 2025. ArtTactic just released its end of year report back in December, and one of the, I think, eye-catching statistics in there, among many, was that if you look at the five kind of main categories within the auction market: impressionist, modern, post-war, contemporary, and then very young artists, aka ultra contemporary artists, guarantees were down in every single one of those categories by between 20% and 65% year over year from 2024, which is just kind of an eye-popping drop across the board. And I think that there are probably a number of reasons that this was the case, and we can talk about those. But my sense of looking at it and thinking about kind of where we're probably headed right now, I just have to believe that there's going to be a significant bounce back from that. I'm picking 25%, which might be even a little on the conservative side, depending on what happens. But it all, I think, comes down to this question of supply. And I think that this past year in the auction market was not one that had a tremendous amount of great stuff coming to market. And obviously, the auction houses only have so much control over that kind of aspect of the market. Even their best pitches aren't necessarily going to be able to pry everything loose that they want every single year. Part of it is based on the infamous 3Ds, death, debt, and divorce. And none of those 3Ds were particularly helpful to the art market last year. All in all, I tend to think that that will, for better or worse, end up flipping a little bit on its head. this coming year. And then I think also the other part of this too comes down to competition between houses. And that takes us to something that I'm curious to hear your perspective on, Adam, which is Sotheby's announcement at the very end of the year that after trying this new radically buyer-friendly fee structure, they're actually just going to scrap it and go back to pretty much exactly what they were doing before, which is also largely exactly what Christie's and Phillips are doing as well. So I think that will end up changing the landscape. And I'm curious how you think about that, Adam, and like how your clients are thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, historically, when it comes to buyers' premiums at the major auction houses, we've seen a pattern where one increases their premium and the other quickly follows. That's why it was so fascinating when Sotheby's initially decided to break from tradition and lower their buyer's premium. It felt almost like an open market experiment to see which strategy, higher or lower premiums, would yield better results over time. So I was really fascinated to see how it would play out. However, it seems it became really clear in the short term that Sotheby's approach wasn't working for them. They began losing market share, and that led to a swift return to their previous business model. Now, another factor I think worth discussing when it comes to the potential for increased guarantees in 2025 is that with the possibility of improved overall market sentiment, we could see more guarantees being offered. I think last year we dealt with a lot of issues that had an impact on the art market, some micro, some macro. But really, one thing that sticks out, this prolonged election cycle, there's a lot of uncertainty it brought. I think it may have discouraged consigners from bringing works to auction who didn't feel confident about the auction market. Now that the election's behind us, there is a chance for greater confidence among potential consigners. And I also think we need to keep in mind that agreeing to consign a work happens months before the auction itself. So economic conditions and sentiment, they can weigh heavily on those consignment decisions. Ultimately, if sellers feel more confident about the market, we might see an uptick in consignments, and as a result, an uptick in guarantors who are more willing to step in and guarantee works that they believe will perform well at auction.
Yeah. I mean, especially just to go back to the Sotheby's fee structure aspect again, my sense out there from talking to people over the course of the past, like the latter half of the year, especially, was that frankly speaking, there just wasn't really as much competition for the best things that were out there because Christie's kind of seemed to have a pretty clear advantage if you were the one consigning the work, just because Sotheby's had made this commitment to really being much more buyer friendly. And so once you have them go back to playing on more of a level playing field, I think that it increases the prospect of actually the two houses having to compete against each other and make sweeter deals for works to get them in the first place. And that on its own might end up really ramping up the return of the guarantee.
Tim, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and sharing your predictions for the art market in 2025, as well as sharing your exclusive prediction for the ArtTactic Podcast audience. If our listeners don't follow you already on social media, they should. Where can we find you there, and how do we find your Substack?
So the Substack, you can find me at thegraymarket.substack.com. That's gray with an A. I am not British, despite what some people who have only read me but not met me seem to think. And I am also on Instagram at _graymarket.
Perfect. Thanks again, Tim. We appreciate it.
Perfect. Thanks so much for having me on, Adam.